Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Power to Fly Diversity Reboot Pride at Work. I'm so excited for our speakers today. I hope you're excited too, because we got some amazing people. So if you are, now that you're just joining us, we're going to go over a little bit of some housekeeping real quick. Throughout this upcoming conversation, your cameras and your microphones will be off, but we would love to hear from you. So feel free to add your comments or questions in the chat box on the right of your screen. And this one with our upcoming speaker, is going to have some participation. So you can chat into the box there, and our speaker is going to be able to interact with you in that way, which is pretty cool. So if you have any technical difficulties, you can tag me or my colleague, Sanmaya here, and we can help you out to get those worked out for you. If you are looking to earn SHRM credits for today's talk, just use the code on the screen to redeem those credits. It's up in the corner there, is one of them, which is 21-GJEMY, but we also got two more for you, 21-P2E3H or 21EF3VG. You get all that? All right, good. So we also want to briefly refer to you to the code of conduct, which we're going to include in the chat for you, so that this talk is just the best experience involved for everybody. So now that housekeeping is taken care of, I am so excited to introduce our first speaker for today in this room is Natalie Egan, who is the CEO of Translator. Now, Translator's Walk of Privilege is 100% anonymous, digital, interactive experience that helps employees develop self-awareness to better understand their own identity and the lived experience of others through the lens of privilege and marginalization. Designed to empower empathy and allyship at scale, this simple and powerful exercise also helps organizations develop data-driven awareness and actionable insights about their employees to create a more inclusive and equitable culture. Translator experiences are highly interactive, 90-minute web-based events with up to 100 participants, although they can be customized for large capacities and different delivery formats. We are so thrilled to be joined by Translator CEO and founder Natalie Egan, who will lead us through this interactive DEI experience. Welcome, Natalie.
Awesome. Thank you, Hunter. That was amazing. Your voice is like, that's like, you have an amazing voice. I think you've got another career there. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining today and participating in this exercise. Happy Pride to everyone, just to kind of put that out there. Very privileged and honored to be here during Pride Month and representing. So thank you all for coming. As Hunter mentioned, my name is Natalie Egan. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the CEO and founder of Translator, where we build diversity, equity, and inclusion analytics software for corporations, schools, and nonprofits. And we have a lot to get through today. So I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to share my screen, and just to kind of like kick us off, and I'll come back to this a couple times. But if everybody could just, if they have their cell phones on them, if you could go to this website, www.join.host. Again, it's www.join.host. There's no .com. So if you could put in this pin 1140, we're going to do this 100% anonymous exercise that Hunter was referencing. And I'll come back to this a couple times, but I assure you there's no personally identifiable information that we collect. There's no app to install. Obviously, it's just a web-based app experience. So if you could just get started by doing that. If you're like, don't have your phone with you, or for accessibility reasons, want to use your desktop or your laptop, you can also open another browser window. You can even put your phone in private browsing mode, or your other browser in private browsing mode if you'd like. But I assure you it's 100% anonymous. So that's just to get us started. I'm going to refer back to that in a second if people are still joining. But as Hunter mentioned, we're going to be doing this exercise here in a second called the Walk of Privilege, but this is a self-awareness and empathy workshop. So this is not a demo, you're actually going to do the real experience here, the way we deliver this in 90-minute sessions, typically for corporations, schools, and nonprofits, like I mentioned earlier. Before we get started, I want to actually just give you a little bit of historical context and background on the Walk of Privilege. And many of you on this call today may have done the Walk of Privilege in a previous life, maybe freshman year orientation in college, or as part of a corporate retreat, or maybe you didn't do it, but you saw the the video that went viral a couple years ago called "What is Privilege" on YouTube. So if you're familiar with the exercise, you know that it's a very powerful exercise, but it also can be highly, challenging. For some people, it can be problematic because it brings up a lot of things, right? And it's very emotional. And ultimately, when you do it in person, which is kind of this image right here, which if we, pre-COVID, pre-technology, we would have done this in person. I would have lined up everybody shoulder to shoulder and read statements like "Step forward if both your parents went to college." And this, by the way, is a room of only 8 people. So there's only 8 people in that picture. So imagine doing it with 500 or 5,000 or 50,000 people. You just wouldn't be able to do it. And so, what we've done is we've digitized it, which takes a lot of those challenges away. But if we had done it in person, part of the problem is that you can see who's stepping forward and who's stepping backwards. Right. And what ends up happening is we out people and we shame people and we otherize people for their privilege or their lack of privilege. And that's not the purpose of the original research that was done by Peggy McIntosh. So Peggy McIntosh pioneered the original research on privilege about 20 years ago. And it was turned into an exercise over time by DEI practitioners. So she didn't really have very much to do with at all with the exercise that was developed. She just created some hypothetical questions that are designed for self-reflection for people to ask themselves and think about. And again, it was turned into this sort of exercise over time, which is sort of good and bad, right? Again, it's good because it helps you understand your privilege and your marginalization, but it's bad because it outs you and it can feel really otherizing. And so what we've done is we've digitized it. So instead of stepping forward, you're going to be swiping forward on your phone today, which also takes away the ableist element of it, right? It's traditionally, this was an ableist exercise that assumes you can stand and walk, which in and of itself is a privilege. And there's all kinds of other challenges with it as well. There's nothing to show for it afterwards. There's no data, there's no support. And oftentimes people are not being very honest because they're like, people are looking at me while I'm doing this. So this opportunity here today is to really look in the mirror and self-reflect and, kind of get comfortable being uncomfortable doing this exercise, but it's only for you. So it's really about your own personal growth and reflection. So for anybody that's just joining, again, if you could go to this website, www.join.host. Again, it's www.join.host and enter this pin 1140. It'll drop you into a holding room where we're going to do the exercise in a few minutes. And I also, for the moderators on the call today and anyone that's helping host the event, there is an incredibly torrential downpour that just broke out of nowhere here. So if I lose internet, I'm going to end up dialing back in through my phone very quickly to continue the conversation. Hopefully that won't happen, but I just want to give everybody a reference point. But I'm in the sort of suburbs of Philadelphia right now, and it's pretty amazing what's happening outside these windows. But getting back to the curriculum, as I mentioned earlier, it's 100% anonymous. There's no personally identifiable information that we collect at all. There's no app to download. And again, it's for your own personal growth and reflection. So if everybody could log in, that would be great. And I'll kind of do a little bit more onboarding here to get everybody ready for the exercise. But basically, as I mentioned earlier, this is not about shaming and otherization. So if you feel shame and you feel otherization, that I want you to note that, right? I want you to hold on to that because we're going to have a conversation about it in a little bit. And typically we would do this on a Zoom call where people could take themselves off mute and actually share out loud. So it's a little experimental today because everybody's going to be chatting through. So if if there's something you want to say, if you want to chat, you can chat both through the Power to Fly tool or through the Translator tool. And Translator is 100% anonymous. So if you chat through that, I'll be able to get your chats in real time and respond to those as if we were having a conversation in person. But again, if you feel things, which you will, as we go through this, I want you to hold on to those because I want you to share them so we can have a conversation about it. But a few more notes before we actually get into the exercise here. I just want to really call out that this exercise can be really, really challenging for people. Sometimes more challenging for some people than others, right? Some people this might not be challenging at all. Like, oh, that was pretty easy. I don't understand what Natalie was talking about, getting this all hyped up. And for other people, this is going to bring back a lot of, memories and thoughts and emotions and things that you may not have considered in a long time or ever thought about in your life. So I just want to acknowledge that this can be really challenging, but your participation today is completely optional. So if part of you is saying, oh my gosh, I don't want to do this right now, you don't have to do this, right? You really do not have to do this. And if any time during the session you don't want to do this, you can just stop, right? So if you just say, oh, I can't take this anymore, you just stop, right? Nobody can tell who stopped. It's 100% anonymous, like I mentioned earlier, but your representation matters. So especially in corporate settings where we're working with clients and they're trying to sort of, adjust their culture and improve their culture, we need everybody's stories, right? So if you already know that you don't have a lot of privilege and you're saying, why am I doing this? It's because we need to hear from you. We need to be able to see and understand your story. And the same thing for people that do have a lot of privilege. Like they're saying, so I already know I have a lot of privilege. Why am I doing this? Right? We also need your stories, and we need that representation here in order to, actually move the needle. Right? There's this great saying in business that if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And so because this is all anonymous, what we typically do is take aggregate feedback from this and help the clients understand their employees and the challenges that they're facing so that the corporation, the organization can start to make, to make changes. So your representation today really matters. So I appreciate you all participating, but it is for your own personal growth and reflection. And in terms of our outcomes that we're looking to generate today, there's two parts to this, right? The first part is to create awareness, right? That's like our most basic thing that we're looking to do today is create more awareness, particularly self-awareness. So, again, you may already understand your own identity, your own marginalizations, but when you start to think about group awareness, other people may not know what you're going through and what your stories are. So by showing this sort of aggregate data, we're gonna have a better understanding as a group and how we move things forward. But the first thing we're here today to do is to create more awareness. And the second thing is to start a conversation. We're not gonna solve all of your problems or all the world's problems. We're not gonna be able to address all of the different dimensions of privilege and diversity, right? We're just starting a conversation. This is only gonna be a 90-minute session. So, we're gonna get through a lot, but we're just gonna be scratching the surface. So really just the business purposes today is to create awareness and to start a conversation. And again, we're gonna have a facilitated conversation afterwards. So hopefully the chat works and you all can, feel free to chat through and I'll help facilitate a sort of chat conversation, which will be kind of fun. But lastly, a few last logistical things before we actually do the exercise itself. So it's a really simple exercise, but it's not intuitive, and that's by design. Okay, so what we've actually done is we've worked with behavioral researchers to intentionally increase the cognitive load of this exercise to force you to think about each question as it comes up, right? So we don't want you to just start mindlessly swiping. We want you to read each question carefully. And the whole thing that I'm gonna sort of really emphasize here is that you need to swipe the opposite direction if it doesn't apply to you. I'll say that one more time. Swipe the opposite direction if it doesn't apply to you. And what's going to happen is the command is going to change. So you got to read each one carefully and just remember, if this doesn't apply to me or I'm trying to say no, you swipe the opposite direction. So sometimes you're going to be swiping up. Sometimes you're going to be swiping down to say no. It's just going to change. And I'll just want to also emphasize that there's no right or wrong answers, right? So go with your gut. Sometimes these questions are going to feel like you're kind of on the fence and you don't know, and you're maybe interpreting the question. You're like, I don't know exactly what this means. Just go with your gut, right? There's no right or wrong answer. And if you swipe the wrong direction, don't worry about it, right? You cannot go back, right? It's just designed to make you think. So if your little privileged position goes the wrong direction, +1 or -1, you can just sort of mentally correct it by saying, okay, I accidentally swiped up, so I'm going to subtract a point from my quote unquote position, my relative privilege position. But there's no skip or back buttons because we don't want you to go back and rethink things. And we also don't want you to skip questions. So again, if anytime you don't want to do this, you can just stop, but you can't skip questions because we really want you to look in the mirror and answer these questions. If at any time during the session, you want to share anonymous thoughts and questions with me and me only, right? You hit this little yellow button in the bottom right-hand corner and you're going to be able to chat with me. And it just sends an anonymous message to me on my text. So it's not printed on the screen. Nobody can see your question. And it's a way for you to ask questions that you might not have felt comfortable asking in front of everybody, or you don't want your name tied to it, or you want to disagree with me or disagree with somebody else. But again, you don't want your name or your identity tied to it. So it's just another way that we create a safe space. In fact, we actually call this safe space technology. So remember, just use that yellow button at any time to ask questions and share thoughts. I'll also ask you to use it a couple times to actually chat in through the platform. But that's it, right? So that's the onboarding. I know that was a little bit exhaustive, but I want to get everybody sort of emotionally ready for this exercise. And so now I'm going to update your phones to the actual walk of privilege. I'll give you about 5 to 6 minutes to complete the exercise, and we'll take it from there. So I'm going to hit this button. It's going to update your phones. There's going to be a little wizard that walks you through. So if you need to like get a little refresher, but go ahead, take your time, answer there's 35 questions, take about 5 minutes. If you have any questions, you can chat them through the platform, both the Power to Fly platform or my own platform, Translator platform. All right, thank you all. I'll check back in a couple minutes. So it looks like we have about 3/4 of the group done. Um, so I'll give you all about another minute or two, but take your time. If you need more time, you can just finish. I'm gonna start the, the curriculum, keep that going, but I'll give you another minute or two. So for everyone that is complete, I just want to acknowledge and first thank you for your participation today. Again, this can be really challenging for people. So people could be in very different places right now emotionally, and I just want to acknowledge that. And for people that have not finished yet, just go ahead and take your time. You can still finish. I'm going to just keep moving forward with the curriculum. And before I do that, I did get a couple questions that have come in, comments. I just want to quickly point out, and one of them I thought was just a really good point that somebody made that said, they were particularly talking about one of the parent questions seemed a little limited as the wording was focused on parents instead of guardians. And that's a great point. And I think all of these are a little bit limited, right? Every question is just designed to make you think. And I'm super glad that that person brought up that point, right? So for people on the call right now that may not have been thinking about the difference between parent and guardian, right? That's a really important distinction and is a big part of the reason the facilitated discussion is so important. So the way we address these questions is it's not, there's so many different questions we could ask, right? We could ask hundreds of different versions of these questions and probably still keep going. But it is designed to strike up a conversation. So I just really want to first thank that person for that share. And a couple of other comments have come in that are really great as well. But I want to, again, thank everybody for their participation and, again, just start moving forward with the content. So if we had done this in person, everybody would be able to see where everybody is in the room in real time. In fact, you'd be able to see which people are stepping forward and backwards for which questions. And that can feel really awkward and feel really otherizing, like I said earlier. And so because we've digitized it now, you can't see where people have been stepping in real time, and you have your own relative privilege position. And what we're going to do now is actually show you the aggregate of this group anonymously. So it's sort of a distribution of privilege and marginalization for this cohort. But before I do that, I want to show you the all-time distribution of privilege with our platform. So this platform's been live for about 3 or 4 years, and this is about 53,000 participants that have been taking it over the last several years. And you can see this distribution left to right. Okay, so these folks over here in the top left corner, they'd be standing in the front of the room. And as you move left to right, this is where people are standing towards the back of the room. This black bar in the middle is effectively the neutral line, or like where everybody would have been standing to get started, right? And then as you move to the right, these folks would have been in the back of the room. And each bar here represents about 300 participants. So when I show you this cohort, it's going to be each bar represents one person. So you should be able to find yourself, relatively speaking, somewhere on this chart. And I also want to just keep in mind that some people, may have rejected this exercise. They don't necessarily want to do it, or they're kind of trying to throw the results. So they might swipe all the way up, or they swipe all the way down the whole way through. But generally speaking, we're going to find people landing here with this acknowledgement that everyone has some privilege some of the time, right? So some of us may have more than others for sure. But I want to just remind everybody that this doesn't define you. It doesn't define your privilege or your marginalization. And it's only your relative position for this set of questions compared to this cohort. So if we redid this set of questions, and then your privilege position would change potentially radically, and it would also change based on the cohort of people that are also taking it with you. So it's just a relative sort of exercise, again, designed to help start a conversation and create awareness. It doesn't define you. It's not good. It's not bad. It's just information that's designed to start a conversation. So I'm going to go back to the platform, and I'm actually going to share the results from this session in real time. So when I hit the results here, it's going to show the distribution for this cohort of the relative privilege for this group for this set of questions. So you can see left to right, there's one person that would have been standing in the front of the room with a relative position of a 33. And as we swipe left or slope left to right, you can see the distribution privilege shifting pretty dramatically as you get towards the neutral line. So these folks over here, their lived experience is a lot more challenging than the folks over here, right? And they may have already known that their whole life. And for them, it may not feel validating. It might feel frustrating to see this. But at the same time, if we're an organization looking to improve our culture, this helps us understand where the opportunities are to improve our culture. So it's really important. And we love to hear from these folks in particular, to hear what it is that they have to say about an experience of this, as well as on the other side and the people in the middle, because the people in the middle oftentimes are like, I thought I had more privilege than I really have, again, relative to this set of questions or this cohort. I thought I'd have more, I thought I'd have less. So there's a lot of surprise here and a lot of validation, some empowerment, some frustration, some anger. Some people are angry they have so much privilege and they don't know what to do about it. And some people are angry they have so little privilege. But I just want to thank you all again for participating and acknowledging the folks with less privilege and more marginalization, that your workload, you have to do more just to exist in the world. So I just want to acknowledge that. And this is the first way oftentimes that we can see that in a way that's measurable. So sometimes we just assume it, but now we can actually measure it. So now we can make progress. So you've just done the exercise. I now want to just back up a minute, okay, and talk about, well, we just did this exercise, but what is privilege? So I've got a few bullet points here on what is privilege. But before we get into that, I want to sort of just use this reference point, this data report, to start an analogy that I think helps me think about what is privilege. So I like to run. I'm a racer. I like to run in competitive contests. And so I like this analogy of a race or a contest, right? So if this was a running race and this green line here at the top was the finish line, right on the top, and these green blocks were all your starting blocks, the people over here on the left would be able to walk to the finish line faster than these folks can run over here. And that's not good or bad. It's just, it is what it is, right? It's just, and so the question is, how do folks over here that have less or more privilege lift up folks that have less privilege to help them with this competitive advantage, right? So as we think about what is privilege, I like to think of privilege as a competitive advantage, usually and almost always an unearned competitive advantage. Things like the color of your skin or your socioeconomic status, right? Who your parents are, what location you were born in. All these little nuances of our identity that we don't oftentimes think about helps inform our privilege and our marginalization, which ultimately gives us a leg up in the world. And again, it's not about shaming or otherizing folks. It's about saying, well, now that we understand this, what are we going to do about it? And even for the folks over here, you still have more privilege than a lot of people in the world. So how do you use the privilege that you do have to lift other folks up? And how do we communicate with the people that have more privilege in order to start to create systemic change? So this is the distribution of privilege. I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint and start to kind of talk through this concept of privilege in more detail, right? So we talked about this first point, what is privilege? Privilege is a unique, unearned competitive advantage. But everyone has some privilege some of the time, and yet some people clearly have more privilege than others on a regular basis, right? And I say regular basis, I emphasize that because there are many different types of privilege, and privilege can change. It can change over time. It can change based on context, location, all kinds of things. But I want to be really clear that not all privileges or marginalizations are equal, right? And each one of us interprets that differently. So for some people, their privilege or their marginalization compared to somebody else's is not equal because of other things, right? Other elements of their identity. So I don't want you all to think that +1, -1 defines the value, the weighted value of your privilege or marginalization. Again, it's just an exercise to help make you think. But privilege, again, changes in all kinds of situations. Like my privilege as a trans woman changes dramatically based on my location throughout the day, right? Like my privilege at home, my privilege at the grocery store, my privilege in New York City versus, you know, a red state in the middle of the country changes dramatically, right? Privilege can change over time slowly, right, as we age. And it can also change overnight. You know, our ability, right, can change overnight. Things like the pandemic, the COVID-19 have changed our privilege overnight, in particular for, you know, the Asian community and or, you know, Black people and brown people on the front lines, right, in service positions. It changes the privilege of how they manage their families and when they can work and when they can't work, right? So there's all kinds of elements that are really nuanced that I just want to call out, but we're not going to get into all the details. But understanding and or validating your privilege or your marginalizations is the first step towards real allyship and representation, right? That's how we are able to act both in small and large ways. So small and large ways as both individual allies and also what we call organizational allyship. So how the company, your organization can start to actually address these institutional inequities, which often run very deep. And they can't be fixed at a global level, but they can be fixed in terms of like the culture, which starts to improve the world. Now, two last points before we shift the conversation here. I like formulas. I think they're easy to remember. I like this first formula. Privilege is the opposite of oppression. So if you have privilege in any given moment, you are not being oppressed. And if you're being oppressed, if you have oppression, you don't have the privilege that other folks in that same situation. So I like this little way of thinking about privilege. Privilege is the opposite of oppression. And the more privilege you have, the less energy it takes to navigate the world, right? That's kind of my favorite because it helps sum up a lot of my story, right? The more privilege you have, the less energy it takes to navigate the world. And, you know, I'll use myself as an example, right? Prior to coming out as a trans woman about 5 years ago, I had so much privilege, I would have broken this test, right? Like I never did it, but if I did it, and I've sort of done it like in my head, like how I would answer questions prior to my transition, I had so much privilege, I would have been off the charts, right? But when I transitioned, I lost so much of my privilege, right? I lost so much of that competitive advantage that I had as I moved through the world as a cis sort of hetero presenting person that was very masculine on the outside. So when I lost my privilege, it was kind of like, you know, the air that we breathe, and we don't realize how much privilege we have until it's taken away from us. And now I have to consume so much energy just moving through the world, going to work, going to the grocery store, picking up my children from school, right? It takes a lot of energy to do that. And even if it's a relatively safe, quote unquote, safe environment, it takes up a lot of mental energy, physical and emotional energy just to go do something I've done many, many times. Because I'm constantly worried, like, is today the day that, you know, my safety's in jeopardy or my kids are made fun of or, you know, worse, right? So that's just a little nice way to kind of put a wrapper on this concept of privilege. Again, this is surface level, but just to kind of help set the stage for the rest of this conversation. So now just, I want to more formally introduce myself. I mean, upfront, Hunter gave a great intro to the company, but I just want to more formally introduce myself to you all and then open it up for more discussion with the Translator chat and or the Power to Fly chat. So as Hunter mentioned earlier, my name is Natalie Egan. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, just so y'all know. And my title is CEO and founder, although I do everything, right? We're an early stage tech company. I do a little bit of everything. But I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've been starting businesses since I was about 5 years old, trying to solve problems, help people, and make a little bit of money on the side since I was about 5 years old. The joke is that I've started over 500 businesses. It's just that most of them didn't have any customers at all. This is my second major venture capital-backed tech startup. I started my first major startup prior to my transition. So I have sort of a unique perspective on gender and power dynamics in the workplace, in particular, having raised venture capital and building a business from scratch. We raised over $7 million and hired over 50 employees. And I did that in a very different identity. And I was a very different person, right? My management style, my whole identity was very different. You can Google me and find out a little bit more about me. You can see pictures of me, which is a little bit embarrassing, but you can see how I presented to the world. And I presented very masculine, again, because I was sort of trying to bury my real identity. But I've been in this space of HR tech and digital transformation, what I call change management software, for over 20 years. I love to speak and represent. I kind of think of myself as a social justice warrior, even though I think warrior is probably not the right word. But I'm constantly advocating for all human rights, in particular gender equality, and in particular transgender rights. So it's a privilege and an honor to be representing today during Pride Month and being a part of this Power to Fly event. You can also find me on social media, most social media platforms, at Natalie J. Egan. I pretty much just do Instagram and LinkedIn, but I'd love to connect with you all there if you want to continue the conversation. But that's a little bit about me. And I want to sort of open this up to you all. So normally, and I forgot to delete this, normally I'd say take yourself off mute, but I would love it if you all could share anonymously through the translator tool. So you just push that little yellow button there in the bottom right-hand corner of your phones, and you can share anonymously to me directly. You can also share through the Power to Fly app, but it's going to get routed to Hunter, and then he'll route it to me. But these are the two questions that I had for you all today. First question is, how did it feel when you saw your relative position? How did it feel when you saw your relative position? And second question, what question made you feel uncomfortable or reflect the most, and why? So what question made you uncomfortable and reflect the most, and why? Now, you can also share whatever else you would like. Obviously this is an open conversation, and we've got about 15 or 20 minutes to actually have a real dialogue here. So I'm going to take what you all chat in through the platform, and I will, facilitate a conversation around that. And again, I apologize. It would be great if I could hear from you all directly. But I'm just going to pause for a second. There are some questions coming in, so I'm going to read a couple of these. But if you want to just share directly through the translator tool, again, it is totally anonymous, so you can share there. But I'm just going to read a couple of these, and we'll have a conversation about it. So give me 1 second. So there's a lot coming in. One person shared that they felt kind of bad. And I would love to just take a minute to unpack that. And I wish we could have a full-blown dialogue here if it was okay in front of everybody. But, the feeling of feeling bad here, I think, is a historical perspective and an emotion that's brought up by years of this idea that there's a stigma, that's a bad stigma around privilege and or marginalization. And it's not good or bad, right? It's really, it just is what it is. And this is, again, just not to reiterate this too much, this is just a relative position compared to a set of questions that could radically change, right? A lot of times people, when they do the walk of privilege, the whole exercise is anchored on one particular dimension of diversity, right? It could be just focused on socioeconomic status, or just focused on ability, or just focused on LGBT status. So that takes a very one-dimensional look at this. What we've done is we've tried to create a very broad set of questions that addresses kind of all the different dimensions of privilege and diversity, which we'll talk about in more detail in a second. But I really want to encourage you not to feel bad here, but just to kind of reflect on it again, because I don't know which way your position was. But if you were on the high side, how do we use your privilege to lift other people up, right? We're not here to make you feel bad about it. And if you're on the lower side, how do you still use the privilege that you do have to lift other folks up and to create representation and to create systemic change, right? And again, if we change these questions, your privilege would change quite a bit. And I wish you could respond to me directly, and I've got all these other texts coming in. So I don't know who's who, but I appreciate all this this content coming through. So I'm just gonna just randomly pick another one because there's so many coming in. So one that said, the question that made me feel uncomfortable was the one about the number of books in my home as a child, right? So I love that question. I love it when people bring that question up because it's really, you know, for a lot of people, very triggering, and it brings up a lot of emotion and thoughts, right? So sometimes people look at that and their initial thought is, wow, I never thought of that as a privilege. I grew up with so many books in my house. I never thought of that as a privilege. And then other people look at that question and say, you know, I grew up with a lot of books in my house, but my parents never read to me, right? Other folks grew up with, you know, empty bottles of whiskey and beer cans in their house, right? One of the most powerful stories that I've ever heard in real time when doing this exercise is someone sharing with me a very, very senior person, almost the CEO of a company, a white man, you know, standing up and sharing in front of everybody saying, I didn't grow up with any books in my house. Everybody expected him, because he said, the question that hit me the hardest was the 50 books question. And everybody expected him to say, I never thought of that as a privilege. And instead he said, I grew up with no books in my house, empty bottles of whiskey and beer cans. My mom died when I was 7, and I had to raise my 3 younger brothers. And my dad was this, you know, alcoholic that was never around. And everybody sort of jaw dropped because they were like, oh my gosh, right? I assumed that this person had everything handed to them. And I never thought that they would have to fight for what they have, or that they would have had these types of obstacles. And it's a moment where everybody gets to say like, wow, what other assumptions am I making about people? What other assumptions am I making about myself, right? And that's a big key right there. We make a lot of assumptions about our own identity. So thank you for sharing that one. So a couple other ones that came in. Questions on experience discrimination would have been different if I lived in a less LGBTQ accepting area and my score or my relative position would have been lower. Yeah, so true, right? Like when I'm in New York City, like I feel really comfortable being me, right? It's such an incredible privilege. And, you know, there's little elements as I move through different parts of New York City. But once I get off the island, I don't feel comfortable anymore. It's weird. Like once the train or the subway or my car leaves Manhattan or Brooklyn, I don't feel comfortable anymore. And part of that is, you know, I have to just continue to remember to check my own, you know, security and sort of, you know, even when I'm moving through those spaces. But there's an incredible amount of privilege that I have in certain spaces like Key West or Fort Lauderdale or New York City or Seattle or, you know, San Francisco. And it's really relative as I shift from block to block sometimes. Like in Philadelphia, which is where I'm from, there's the neighborhood. But once you step outside the neighborhood, and even when you're in the neighborhood, like there's so much traffic through it that has nothing to do with it. It's so small that it quickly shifts. So thank you for sharing that question. That was a great thought. Some other stuff coming through. And again, I'm just reading these in real time, so I don't even know. So this person wrote, not too surprised. As a Black woman, I definitely didn't expect to be on the higher end, but it made me focus on the ways that I am privileged and take for granted. So whoever shared that, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think, listen, we all, I think, if depending on our marginalized identity, we oftentimes think we're at the bottom of the barrel, or we don't take into context the privileges that we do have. And so, you know, I can't speak for the Black community at all. I don't even want to attempt to do that. I wish I could take this person off mute and hear from them directly. But marginalized communities, we oftentimes feel like, you know, we have no privilege, or everybody has more privilege than us. And I'll share just, again, a personal story. You know, I'm a white trans woman. I'm able-bodied. You know, I have a lot of resources and, you know, a lot of privilege. But when I transitioned, I thought I lost all my privilege. Right. I remember really one day, like very early in my transition, I expressed this anxiety to my friend that I didn't want to walk down the street in front of construction workers because I was afraid of what they would say or you know, potentially intervene with me based on my identity. And the person looked at me a little curious and they said, "What do you mean? You know, why are you worried about that? Like all marginalized people have to deal with that as they walk in front of, you know, groups of folks like that." And I don't want to, you know, put a label on all construction workers, but I'm just telling you the story of this one particular example in New York City where, a lot of people were on a lunch break and I didn't want to walk in front of them. And they said to me, look, if you were an overweight woman, if you were an underweight woman, if you were a cis woman, if you were, they just listed all these different identities, right? And all of a sudden I realized, I'm like, oh, it doesn't have anything to do with me being trans. It's just that I'm not at the sort of center of power as I stroll down the street anymore. And it was a really eye-opening experience for me to realize that, like, while I've lost a lot of privilege, I still have a lot of privilege. So as a trans woman, still have a lot of privilege relative to the trans community at large. I have a lot of privilege, more privilege than most. And I'm trying to use my privilege to move the world forward, right? That's a big part of my backstory is, I realized that I wanted to use the privilege I do have to pay it forward and help all people. But in particular, the Black trans community, the brown trans community, in particular, Black trans women. And then you think about the intersectionality and how that sort of, unfolds, like Black trans, disabled, with some socioeconomic challenges thrown in. I mean, people really out there are really struggling. So thank you for sharing that. So there's so many questions coming in. I'll read just one last one, and then we're going to move through some more content. And again, I'm just reading these in real time. So somebody wrote, my body was moved emotionally by the questions. It's hard acknowledging these struggles. It's a painful reminder of the past, but also a reminder of the privileges I do have. A reminder of all I can do to be a better ally. I wish my uncle was here to experience this world he died dreaming of. Thank you. And then thank you for whoever shared that. I get really emotional when I read these things, right, in these conversations, because I can so deeply relate to that. And I think a lot of times, a lot of folks on the call can, relate to that in different ways for different elements. It's a very multidimensional comment. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I mean, listen, we've lost so many people and we have so much work to do. There's so much work to do. And we're going to talk about allyship in just a few slides. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I just want to thank everybody for chatting in. I mean, I can't even keep track of all these questions and comments that have been flowing through, but we're going to have another chance to have a conversation. So, for people that still want to share, we'll be able to, pull in elements of this conversation a little bit. But I want to now shift the conversation and focus on this framework that we didn't create, but we've sort of modified. This has existed for quite some time. It's called the different dimensions of diversity. And it's an exercise, a framework to help you understand, all of the different elements of what makes us who we are. So I know you all have been chatting in through the Translator tool. What I would love for you to do is share with me the first three things that come to mind. Could be simple, just one word statements. What most informs your identity? So in other words, what makes you you? And some people out there might write, I'm a mother, right? Or I'm trans, or I'm black, right? They could just say the word black or brown or white or Asian or, two-spirit, all the things that make you you, right? So I just take a moment and just reflect, what are the first three things that come to mind, the first three words that come to mind when I say, who are you? What makes you you? I'm just going to pause for a second. I'm going to take a sip of my drink, and hopefully we'll see lots of chats coming in here. So I'll reflect on a few of those in a moment. Yeah, wow, thank you. There's so much coming through here. I'll read some of these. Female, lesbian, immigrant, artist, helpful, gay man, female, culture, overweight, mother, insecure, wife, lesbian, educated, gay, woman, tall, right? So there's all these great words flowing through. Primary wage earner, writer, smart, faith, husband, humor, black, woman. Yes, thank you for sharing all these. Advocate, helper, autistic. Thank you for sharing that. My son is autistic. Bisexual, pagan, survivor, right? Daughter, Latinx, queer, female, maker, shy. I mean, there's all this incredible stuff coming through, pansexual, Filipino, immigrant, non-binary. So all I want to do here is just sort of, and please keep sharing, is sort of reference, there's just so much that makes us who we are, that makes us, that informs our core identity. So if you kind of think about this framework here that I'm about to share, this is designed to help us understand all of the different things that make us who we are, which ultimately informs our privilege and our marginalizations in a lot of ways. So on the far left hand side, you have this like this sort of egg, right? Our core identity, this nucleus of who we are. And as we move left to right, I'm going to sort of unfold or share all the different dimensions of diversity. And these are not ranked in order. This is not like a ranking. This is just kind of in order of the way that we oftentimes think about these things. But they're all sort of equally feed our identity, and our privilege and our marginalizations. So we have this first layer, which we call our primary dimensions of diversity. And these are kind of the things that we think about the most, right? They're kind of the government box checking, things that are the things that we see in the media a lot, our age, our ethnicity or our race, our gender identity, our sexual orientation, our physical ability, our mental ability. These are all different elements of our diversity that inform our core identity. And a lot of people shared things right along this early spectrum. But I want to start to expand what we think of, what makes us who we are, right? We have all these secondary values. Again, secondary is not a ranking. It's just a way of thinking about this as a framework. So there's our religion and our values, our geographic location, our communication style, our parental and family status, our marital and relationship status, our socioeconomic status, our language, our accent, our working style, our education. All of these things inform who we are. And by the way, so many of these things are informed by our primary, right? Our communication style will vary dramatically by our gender and or our race, right? And so you start to think about how all these things interconnect and they form, these sort of privileges and marginalizations and ultimately form our core identity. So the next layer is kind of organizational, right? So it's where do we sit inside of our organization? What is our occupational status, right? Are we employed? Are we unemployed? Where do we sit inside of our organization? Are we at the leadership level? Or are we kind of front lines? Where is our location, right? Are we at headquarters? Or are we out remote? So all of these things inform our sort of status and our sort of hierarchical power within inside of an organization. And then there's the cultural element, right? The elements of power and time and personal space, conflict resolution, our body language, right? All of these things, era and generational, right? Social events like COVID-19, right? How do those affect our core identity, right? Things like 9/11, right? Environmental events like what's happening in Detroit with, clean water, and world events like the pandemic. All of these things become unique informers of our identity at, different levels. And you imagine if you were to kind of stitch a line between all of them, ultimately that makes us who we are. And we don't do a lot about it, right? These are kind of, in a way, it's all about a lottery, right? Oftentimes when I'm talking about privilege, I think about it as a lottery, right? You don't really have a lot of control over these things. Some you can influence a little bit over time, but a lot of these things are based on the color of our skin, who our parents are, when we were born, where we were born, all kinds of unique, our DNA, right? That inform our diversity and our privilege and our marginalizations. So I'd like to share this framework just to kind of help us now have a conversation about equality versus equity. So we talk a lot about equality in this country since it was founded, right? All men are created equal, right? Well, first of all, we're not all men, and we are certainly not all created equal. Now, I get that the intent was probably different back then, hopefully, but the way that is, translated today, and the way we indoctrinate people with this idea of like equality, well, equality is this idea of not seeing color, right? It's the idea of treating everybody equally, even though we're not all equal. And let me tell you, I'm not a Black person. I am trans, but if I were a Black person, or I want people to see my color, right? Like, I want to be seen for who I am. I want that to be acknowledged because we are not all equal. And that's obvious. You can tell by the privilege distribution earlier. So I want to talk about this concept of equity, which is focusing on outcomes. And it takes into account the systemic disadvantages that we have and the advantages we have. And it really strives for both fairness and inclusion, right? So I really would love to swap out the word equity for equality. So instead of equality for all, it should be equity for all, right? And there's people out there that will sort of, wrestle with me or kind of have arguments with me about the nuances of this. But I really want to get our focus on this word equity. And I love this little cartoon here, this little like kind of comic style cartoon that many of you may have seen previously. But it helps really illustrate this in a visual capacity. I'm a visual learner, so I love visual learning. And this is this idea of equality. You can see on the left-hand side, there's three people all trying to watch a baseball game. And equality would be giving them all the same size box, regardless of who they are. And obviously that doesn't make any sense here. The person on the left doesn't even need a box. Like, they could be seeing over the fence probably without the box. And the person on the right, obviously needs two boxes in order to see the game. So if we kind of shift from equality to equity, we can now see that redistribution, and people will kind of get really defensive about this because they think the pie shrinks when they give a little bit more to somebody else because they need it. And that's not the case at all. It's the pie is actually sort of ever expanding, and we as a human race have the capacity to deliver upon that, but we spend too much time fighting with each other, and that's like a whole nother conversation I want to get into right now. But equity focuses on outcomes, and you can see that really clearly illustrated here in the second panel. But I want to show you this third panel, which is the unfortunate reality, right? And it's really interesting how this mirrors the privilege distribution that we developed earlier. So we actually came across this little cartoon later after we created that distribution graph. And again, this is not to make you feel bad, but it's designed to make you think and say, well, how do I take all these boxes I have and redistribute them so that everybody has access to the types of opportunities that they're interested in? Like, if this person wants to watch the game, right? And I don't want to even say kid, right? A lot of times people will say that's the kid and the other person's the father. We don't know that, right? This person wants to watch the game. So how do we get them out of the hole that they're in? Because they are literally already starting in a hole, right? And these people on the left, they oftentimes have more boxes than they really need. So again, just designed to make you think. If you're feeling bad right now about how much privilege you have or how much you don't have, it just take into account, like, well, how do we create change then, right? This is not here, we're not here to shame you. Some people still feel shame in this moment, right? We'll have some really pretty awesome conversations because I find them to be empowering to have the conversations, but people will still feel triggered and they'll feel bad and they'll feel ashamed about their privilege or their lack of privilege. And that's not what we're here to do, right? We're just here to kind of illustrate this and move us forward. So I'm going to do another group discussion. You all were great on that previous conversation, sharing through the translator tool. So I don't have any doubt that you'll continue to share here. So what I'm going to do is ask two more questions, and this kind of is focused on equity and equality, but it's also an opportunity to continue the dialogue and share anything that's coming up for you. So the first question is, what parts of your identity or your lived experience has shaped the way you see the world, right? What parts of your identity or lived experience has shaped the way you see the world? And maybe share like an anecdote as well, like why, right? So if it's your identity as a Black woman, right? How has that shaped your world? Like what about that has helped shape the world? So feel free to share through the translator tool. And then also another question I would love to hear from some folks on is, what inequity issues do you care about most and why? So what inequity issues do you care most about and why? And I'll just share, with you all, again, I talked a lot about, I sort of, feel like I'm constantly fighting for all human rights, but I do in particular focus on gender and gender equality in particular in the workplace because of my unique experience having been the CEO of a company prior to my transition and building a company in my old identity versus now. So I can really see the inequity in the workplace that in ways that I could have never seen it before, right? You could have explained it to me all day long, but I would have never been able to understand it until I actually experienced it. So I care very deeply about that in particular in the workplace. And then obviously I focus a lot on transgender rights, but we're going to talk about allyship in a few minutes and how do we become a better ally for all folks? Because I would love to tell you all that I'm an ally for all marginalized people, but the reality is, even though I care about all folks, I also don't always know what to do. So we're going to talk about allyship in a few minutes. And I just wanted to share that while people are sharing through. So a lot of people have shared here. And I'm picking these off here. Somebody shared, they wrote the word schizoaffective. So I love that. I'm not sure if that's intentional. I've never seen that version of the word schizo, what people might have traditionally called schizophrenic. And I actually like removing the word frantic there because there's such a negative connotation with it. But what they wrote is, you never know what a person may be going through just based on their appearance. And absolutely, right? I mean, right, like we never know what people's lived experiences are. I think that's a big part of the lesson here, is that we make assumptions about folks based on what we see on the surface, right? And there's a great, if we had more time, I would show you, there's a great framework that's designed to help us understand kind of the parts of our identity that are visible to the world and the parts of our identity that are below the waterline. It uses this idea of an iceberg to help us illustrate how much of our identity is below the surface that people can't see. It's that sort of 80-20 rule. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to do a little bit more research on that myself, because I'd like to know more about that particular word. So a couple other things people have texted in. Someone wrote in being a Black and Latinx female. So both, right? The sort of intersectional components of the Black identity and the Latinx, as well as being female. And every time I try and read these, it bumps it. Having been taught that I have to work twice as, hold on, I just lost it again. It keeps moving, hold on. Shoot. Every time somebody shares, it like moves it on my screen. Hold on. Having been taught that I have to work twice as hard to get half as far, and this has been accurate. This has been my lived experience. So thank you for sharing that. And I think, yes, a lot of us, based on our identities, are taught that we have to work twice as hard, right? Or 3 times as hard, or that we're never going to be accepted for identities. And we're taught a lot of things as a young age that that are really unique to our own identities, right? When again, just because no one else can share out loud here, just to kind of expand on that, what I learned very quickly when I came out as a trans woman is that a lot of women are taught things by other women and or their parents or guardians, their maternal figures, oftentimes in their life, that that men or boys are never taught, right? One experience I had with that is very early in my transition, I left a bar with a girlfriend of mine. It was probably just a few weeks into my transition. It was late at night and it was a dark parking lot, and I left the parking lot and I said goodnight to her, and I went over to my car and I started digging through my purse looking for my keys. And she came running over to me and she said, "Oh my gosh, Natalie, like, never do that. Never look for your keys outside your car." She said, "You need to get your keys out when you're still in the establishment, and you carry them a certain way to protect yourself." And I was shocked. I mean, I just had no idea, right? And that moment for me made me realize, like, oh my gosh, like, what other things are we taught that are women are taught, or Black people are taught, or brown people are taught, or people with different abilities are taught in order just to survive. And there's a great video that was released called The Talk, which again, as a white person, I don't necessarily feel 100% comfortable talking about because of my lived experience, but it really illustrates the lived experiences of Black people in particular, the dynamic between a parent and a child, talking about what the child should do, a Black child should do if they're pulled over by the police, to keep their hands on the wheel and to keep their music down, and to speak in a certain way, yes ma'am, no ma'am, or sir, in order to protect them, right? And so those elements that happen in the early stages of our cultural identity as we're being formed, a lot of times other people don't understand those. So that's why I love this question, because it starts to bring out a lot of the things that we may not understand about people's identities and their lived experience. Someone else just shared in, I overcompensate because of what my mother experienced. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, again, I could read that so many different ways. Someone else wrote in, I would plan my route walking to class to avoid certain locations to avoid harassment from men. Um, Somebody wrote, being a black girl takes by a single black mom and aunties has given me a fortitude and a will that otherwise I would not have. I'm much more resilient than my husband, who is a Caucasian man from a much higher socioeconomic environment. He's often amazed that we did not have some of the knowledge, or that I don't know so much of my history. Yeah, I mean, I totally relate to that. At this point in my work, in my equity work, I'm most concerned about the inequities that are still life-threatening for people. Totally get that. And I love this work that we do, by the way, because I feel very optimistic that we're saving people's lives. Somebody else shared in, as a white gay man, I have often felt guilt around my white privilege and have also felt I shouldn't talk about feeling oppressed for being gay. And I really just want to sort of center that for a second, because I think think about how much that's shifted since like the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, right? Like a gay white man feeling like they can't talk about their oppression for being gay. And there's this assumption today that being gay is like easy. And yes, it is relatively compared to, again, a long time ago, but, it's still very, very challenging to be any marginalized person. And I just want to encourage whoever shared that, that, using the right language and the right sort of context to talk about that can really help. Again, but there's this like stigma in the world. I mean, I've bumped into it where, somebody will say to me, they'll make an offhanded comment at a party about how easy it is for their friend's gay son to come out now, as if it's not a big deal at all. And I mean, imagine coming out as gay in high school today. It's still hard. That depends so much on your location and your family and the school that you're in. And, even if it's easy in some components, it's hard in others. So I just don't want to take that lightly as a comment that someone shared. And I know we're coming up here on time, and there's so many people who have shared through the platform. So I just want to thank everybody for that. And this all is, conversation that helps feed a bigger conversation in the world. And it's going to help share this with Power to Fly to help improve content and programming, and ultimately help other organizations become better workplaces and improve the culture of the world. So I want to move this conversation into allyship. And so we oftentimes think about allyship as a noun, right? But I really want us to think about allyship as a verb, right? Allyship is an action. It's something that we do. It's something that, is part of an ongoing action that we take daily. And I also just want to encourage people here to just reflect on the fact that, or this idea that we can't really call ourselves allies. I mean, I don't want to get into a sort of semantic argument about it, but really, like, in order for us to be an ally, somebody else has to call us an ally, right? If I were to ask everybody here on this call, raise your hand if you think you're an ally, I think everybody would raise their hand, right? But it's the moment of allyship, the action of allyship, the experience of allyship that I have of a person that makes them an ally to me, right? And that's the kind of defining moment there, is the allyship, to another person. And allyship is more than just being like a fan, right? Like, it's like, I'm a fan of Black people. I'm a fan of disabled people. Like meaning like, I don't mind them, right? That's not allyship. Like, allyship is actively advocating for folks, right? It's not just not minding them or having a friend or two that happens to be of some marginalized experience, right? Allyship is an action. And there's an entire continuum that I want to highlight here. And the words don't matter as much as this idea that this is a continuum, right? And it's ongoing, and it's multidimensional for all those different dimensions of diversity that we talked about earlier. So imagine every single component of that framework has its own continuum. Like, there's its own, sort of, I don't want to say the word spectrum, but this own continuum of allyship. And it ranges from apathy, which has a negative connotation, but it's really just this idea of just not understanding the issues. you don't really, you're sort of apathetic to the cause or the issue. And as you move left to right, obviously you move towards being more of an active ally, advocating, committed routinely and proactively championing inclusion for any given dimension of diversity. So I'll share with you, just to be vulnerable, and because again, we can't take ourselves off mute here, but I have told you a couple times here today, I believe, that I would like to say that I'm an ally for all folks, right? All marginalized people. And I know that that's not true, right? Because along this continuum, I'm more advanced for some folks than others, right? And while I'm a really strong advocate for gender rights, in particular, women in the workplace and transgender rights more broadly, I have a lot of work to do for people with different abilities, right? I know that. And it goes deep for me. I don't quite understand why. I mean, I have some theories about why this is, but I think it goes back to my childhood, right? I think it goes back to my parents teaching me not to look at other people that are different from me. In particular, people with things like cerebral palsy or autism or different physical abilities. And I think what they meant was don't stare, but I kind of read it as don't look at them. And so what I've realized is that I have trouble making eye contact with folks with different abilities. And that's something I'm actively working on, always, right? And I just moved into a new neighborhood. I just moved, and one of my neighbors has a child that has a pretty severe case of cerebral palsy. And I noticed that moment that we connected, that I had that little moment of like, and then I adjusted for it, right? But that's where now, especially as a neighbor, I have this opportunity to really dig in and become a better advocate and a better ally for this community of people out there, not just themselves, but their families around them, right? How can I help? How can I use my platform, my privilege to help them? So I just want to kind of use this as a framework to set up this last part of the conversation. And I would love for you all to share through the platform today, through the Translator tool, what personal commitment will you make towards allyship? And you don't have to share it quite yet, because I'm going to give a couple examples. And I would love for you, though, as we kind of wrap up today, to share what it is for you that, kind of pops out, that where you're going to make a commitment and say, I'm going to do this, right? And the first thing that I would encourage everybody to do is to do this continuous audit, right? Continually assess where you are on the allyship continuum, right? So that, as I mentioned earlier, is a continuous thing. So what can you build into your routine to kind of check yourself and say, how do I continually assess this? And I'll give you some ideas about that. But the first thing I want to emphasize that's more tactical in terms of how we move through the world is to actively talk about other people's expertise, recommend people, and advocate for others' career goals. And when I say other, I mean specifically people that are different from you. And I don't mean to otherize people at all, but I mean different from you, right? People that don't look like you, they don't, speak like you, they don't have the same background. So in a moment where you're in a meeting or you're in a situation, really stepping up and advocating and speaking for those people, to make sure you're advocating for them, especially in the workplace with career goals. So another example of that is just, a little bit more nuanced, is to repeat someone's good idea and give them credit. So oftentimes we'll find ourselves in a meeting where somebody says something and, they don't get heard, or somebody else, sort of steps over it or almost takes credit for it. So it's really important that we advocate for the person that shared that and give them credit, cite them, say, as Ashley just shared, I would like to really, focus on that for a minute and X, Y, and Z, right? So it's repeating someone's good idea and giving them credit. And there's a great little framework out there called Shine Theory, if you want to Google that, by Amita So and her partner, who created this concept that is really simple framework that's based on this idea that, you don't shine if I don't shine, right? You don't shine if I don't shine. And if you take that philosophy with you into, all aspects of your life, in particular the workplace, it's going to be a really powerful way for you to, lift other people up and give them the opportunity to really shine. So that's another little bullet point there. This fourth one I love, right? This is basically like summarized. It's do the work, right? Investigate publications, podcasts, and social media to help educate you to become a better ally for those that are different from you. The publications, the podcasts, the social media, like in social media in particular, there's so many great resources out there. I always mention one called Allyship Academy on Facebook. So people that still use Facebook, if you log into Facebook and type in the search Allyship Academy and just like it, what'll happen is every day you'll get sort of a drip feed of posts that people from all over the world, or folks that are publishing from perspectives that are all over the world, that just share things with you that you may not be thinking about. And oftentimes, just to be honest, like it makes me uncomfortable. Not often, but every once in a while, right? I see things that I go, oh, I don't agree with that, or that makes me uncomfortable. And what I do when I have that moment, when I have that uncomfortable reflex, I respond to it with saying, why? Right? And I dig in a little deeper and I get curious and I embody this position of curiosity as opposed to judgment. And it allows for me to lean in and kind of figure out other people's perspectives and why people see things the way they do through their lived experience. But this is doing the work, and it's seeking out podcasts and other blogs and things like that to help educate you, because it is not a marginalized person's job to educate you. So while you might sort of leave the session and say, oh, I'm going to go, ask my friend X, Y, whatever their name is, how do I become a better advocate for their community? That's not their job, right? That oftentimes really wears them out. They don't want to do that necessarily. And even if you have a good relationship with them, I would do the work first, right? Like sometimes people say, well, I know that person so well, I feel like I can ask them, but do the work first, right? You can oftentimes find out what you need to know. And then you can kind of share with folks a little bit and be humble, right? Oftentimes people ask me about, how do I become a better advocate for trans folks with, pronouns and things like that. And part of it's doing the work, and part of it is then just, trying to get involved and like realize that you might mess things up, but just be humble when you do that and be quick to, acknowledge that you're on a journey, right? We're all on a journey. I'm on a journey. I'm constantly learning, right? Somebody used some words earlier that I'd never seen before. So I'm going to do the research and find out what those words mean. And lastly, just I always love to end on this. A great way to become a better ally is to believe other people and their experiences, right? Listen and ask questions when it's appropriate, right? But oftentimes you wouldn't believe potentially how often people don't believe my experience, right? I'll say, this or that happened, on my way to work this morning, or, at the end of the day yesterday, this thing happened, or, at the party the other night, Bob said this thing, and people will say to me, really? Are you sure? Like, are you sure? You sure Bob really said that? Because I don't think Bob would say that, or Bob didn't really mean that. Bob would never do that. And it's unbelievable to me that people don't believe my experience, and that spills out into all other marginalized experiences. So I would always say trust first. If somebody gives you reason later to potentially not trust them, then that's a different conversation. But when somebody says to you, this or that happened, listen to them, right? Listen to them and ask questions about it. Say, hey, can you share a little bit more about that thing? Because I would like to understand it, rather than saying, are you sure that happened? Right? Because one is very dismissive and invalidating, and one is very validating and pulls me in, right? It's an inclusive approach. So I would just ask you all just to take a moment through the platform, what commitment, whether it's on this list or not, are you comfortable, committing to become a better allyship? And somebody through the platform asked what the Facebook page was again. It's called Allyship Academy. And it's just one of many. I just like it because it's, I can sort of click it once and forget about it. And whenever I log into Facebook, I see that feed, and it's just a helpful reminder. Also on social media, again, I sort of stopped using Facebook for a very long time, but I've become a member of a lot of Facebook groups. I joined a lot of groups in particular for trans support. And there's a lot of trans allyship groups. There's a lot of allyship groups that are particular for groups of people. So I would look into those as well. And there's a lot of other great shares here. Somebody shared seeking out opportunities to learn more and broaden my understanding of other people's experiences. So yes, thank you for sharing that. One little tip that I like to share is based on a little story that one of my training partners always shares. But she calls it, sort of thinking about your trusted 10, right? Or your trusted 5 or your trusted 2. It's really just a way of thinking about like, who do you go to when you've got big news or you have a question that you want to ask, right? That's really important. Who are the people that you go to? And oftentimes that trusted group of people looks just like you. And it's just a moment. It's not good or bad. Just think about that. Do they look like me? And it's a way of saying, well, maybe I should expand this group of people. So next time you have a big question or something, maybe reach outside your network to somebody that you don't normally reach out to. And it also goes from big questions down to little things as well, right? So I oftentimes, this is based on another story that was shared with me. Somebody shared with me a long time ago. They said, if you want to get to know other people, right? Because change happens through relationship, right? So change happens in relationship. So you have to have a relationship with another person in order to start to change. Because until you understand them and their lived experience, you're not going to change. So one little way to start to meet new people is, in the moment, right? Like let's say you're at Starbucks and you don't know what time it is, right? Or you're, standing in New York City and you don't know which way Fifth Avenue is. Typically when we have a question, a simple question like that, like what time is it? We're going to reach out to a person that looks like us, right? Or that we kind of, use our unconscious bias to, decide whether or not we trust them or that we should, start speaking with them. And so what I would encourage you all to do is next time you have that moment, check your bias, check yourself and say, oh, I was about to reach out to this person that, for me, like oftentimes reach out to like people that generally, I'm just going to admit that there's some unconscious bias in this here, and I may not always be right, but I'll typically reach out to somebody that looks like they're in my community, right? They're queer in some capacity, or maybe they're, that's like kind of my first go-to. So what I'll oftentimes do is reach out to somebody in that moment. I'll be like, oh, I was about to reach out to this, this person here that's got, a rainbow flag on their book bag or whatever it is. And I'm going to reach out to like the opposite person, right? I'm going to reach out to somebody that doesn't look like me. And you'll be so surprised at the conversations you can start there and the things that you have in common with people and how quickly barriers get broken down because you're going to make assumptions about them. And obviously, if you don't feel safe, I don't want you to encourage, if you don't feel safe asking somebody, that's a wholly different conversation. But just kind of in that moment, take a second, like a look around and say, who in here do I not have things in common with that I could ask this question to? And I'll tell you, in a Starbucks once, I started a conversation with an 85-year-old Black woman that lasted like 30 minutes. And it was one of the most enriching and fulfilling conversations. And we had so much more in common than I would have ever expected. And it was a really beautiful conversation. So I just encourage you all to push yourselves, in that capacity. Thank you for that share. I know I've riffed quite a bit on that. And there's a lot of other shares that have come in here. Somebody shared, I commit to speaking up, even if I feel like a broken record. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Thanks. And someone else shared, thank you for bringing up not calling ourselves allies. That's a huge red flag to me when someone claims they're an ally themselves. And I totally get that. Another sort of a parallel to that is when someone claims they're a leader. Like if you look at their social media, their LinkedIn profile, and it says, sales leader. Anyone that calls themselves a leader, I always sort of question. So it's the same thing with allyship. So thank you for sharing that. So we've got about 4 minutes left here. I'm going to wrap this up, give you my contact information if you want to continue the conversation. I'm also going to update your phones to one closing last little exercise where I'm going to ask you if you would be so kind to fill out this anonymous demographic self-ID. It is, again, completely anonymous. It helps us take the aggregate results and shape them based on different dimensions of your identity. So when we start to do analysis and recommendations and look at the broader information, we can say, wow, Black men are experiencing this particular issue more than white men. So that helps us create systemic change. So I'd really appreciate it if you could fill out the self ID. There's also a very quick little couple sliders where you can say, if you'd recommend this exercise to a peer, and did it help you develop empathy? And then also, if we're allowed to, I'd love it if Hunter or somebody from the Power to Fly team could follow up with me. We have some follow-up resources that we can send out to folks that I would love to share in the next 24 hours, just to help continue the dialogue. But here's my contact information here on the screen. I'm just going to navigate away really quick to update your phones to the closing questions. So your phone should have all updated. I'm going to put my contact information back up on the screen. You can email me at Natalie@translator.company. Just remember, it's .company, not .com. And then also on Instagram at Natalie J. Egan, and LinkedIn at Natalie J. Egan. So I want to thank everybody for your participation today. That was really enriching and fulfilling and powerful to be on this platform representing, in particular, the trans community during Pride Month. So I want to thank the entire Power to Fly team, in particular, Andrea Barry, for starting this incredible company, and everybody along the way that has helped make this an opportunity and a conversation today. So I'm going to shut up. Anybody who wants to continue to chat through the tool, you can continue to chat anonymously with me. You can follow up with me on social media and my email here. And then if you all could update your surveys, that would be really helpful. And someone just thanked me. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and lived experiences, Natalie. This has been wonderful. So thank you. I always say thank you for thanking me. Thank you for showing up. It is truly a privilege and an honor to be here with you all today. And a couple other people have continued to text in some great compliments. I appreciate that so much. But I am complete. I'll give you all another minute or two to fill out the survey. And when you're finished, you can just drop off the call. And Hunter, I'll hand it back to you if there's any follow-up.
Thank you, Natalie Egan. If everyone's doing a digital round of applause, I certainly hope so, because I am truly incredible, and I really am grateful to be able to participate in this and meet you in this space. Please do go to Natalie's website, email her, follow up. We're going to go straight to another talk in just a minute, so if I get cut off, just know that, Natalie, you did a fantastic job. Thank you. It's just, I hope everyone enjoyed that as much as I did.